The Korean Mafia boss Seo Jin-hoon had destroyed Naomi Rivers with cold, calculated precision. He hadn't just broken her heart, he had publicly humiliated her in front of everyone who mattered, forcing her to her knees over a lie and branding her a traitor without a second thought. 1 year later, the Ice King of Seoul thought she was nothing more than a ghost of his past until he saw her again. But Naomi wasn't the broken woman he remembered. She was standing tall, and she was raising his twins in the very shadows of the empire that had discarded her. The moment Jin-hoon realized the truth, something inside him didn't just crack, it shattered. Looking at those two faces, he knew his past wasn't finished with him, and the woman he once crushed was now the only one in control. Seo Jin-hoon poured a glass of whiskey, but his hand trembled, a microscopic weakness he would have killed a subordinate for noticing. The silence of his penthouse office usually brought him clarity, but tonight, it felt like a cage. The image of the twins burned behind his eyelids. Their eyes. His eyes, Jin-hoon is about to destroy his own empire for a second chance. Before we see if she forgives him, hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss the moment the Ice King finally kneels. The shape of their mouths. It was like looking into a mirror that reached back into a past he thought he had buried. Sir. Secretary, Min's voice cut through the heavy air. He placed a thin manila folder on the obsidian desk. The preliminary background check on Naomi Rivers. Jin-hoon didn't reach for it immediately. He stared at the seal, a sense of impending dread coiling in his gut like a snake. He had built his empire on knowing everything before his enemies did, but for the first time in his life, he was terrified of the truth. The children, he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. How old? 11 months, sir. Jin-hoon froze. The air in the room seemed to vanish. He picked up the file, his fingers tightening on the cardstock until it creased. He flipped it open. There it was, printed in stark black ink. Date of birth, November 12th. He did the math. He didn't want to, but his mind, trained for complex logistics and calculated risks, made the deduction instantly. 11 months old. 9 months of pregnancy. That meant conception happened 20 months ago. The glass in his hand shattered. He didn't feel the whiskey soaking his cuff or the shards biting into his palm. He only felt the cold, suffocating weight of the past crashing down on him. 20 months ago, they were still engaged. 20 months ago, he was still waking up next to her. That meant the night of the gala, the night he had projected the evidence of her betrayal onto the screen for the elite of Seoul to see, the night he had called her a whore and thrown her out into the rain. She wasn't just his fiancée. She was the mother of his unborn children. He closed his eyes, and the memory of that night played out in agonizing high definition. He remembered Naomi's face. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't fought the guards dragging her out. She had just held her stomach, her face pale and protective. He had interpreted it as guilt. Now he knew it was fear. Sir? Min stepped forward, eyeing the blood dripping from Jin-hoon's hand onto the pristine report. Jin-hoon ignored him. A fissure cracked through his certainty. If she was pregnant with his children that night, the narrative of her cheating made no sense. Naomi was proud, but she was not a liar. The photos. The text messages. Seo Yura had brought them to him. Yura had verified them. He looked at the bloody smear on the file. Get the car, Jin-hoon ordered, his voice devoid of all warmth. And find the original digital files from the investigation last year. Every single pixel. He wasn't just looking for a woman anymore. He was looking for a crime scene, and he was starting to suspect that he had been the weapon used to commit it. Seo Yura sat in her vanity chair, the silk of her robe slipping over skin that cost millions to maintain. Her phone buzzed, not a call, but a priority notification from a private server. She swiped it open, and her perfectly practiced expression curdled into something ugly. It was a surveillance photo taken from a distance. A woman in a park. A double stroller. Yura's fingers pinched the screen, zooming in until the pixels blurred. It wasn't just that Naomi Rivers was back in Seoul. It was the children. Even in the grainy image, the shape of their eyes and the set of their jaws were undeniable. They were Seo Jin-hoon's blood. Panic flared in Yura's chest, hot and acidic. If Jin-hoon saw this, if he realized he had an heir, let alone two, the wedding, the merger, and her precarious hold on the syndicate would evaporate before morning. She dialed a number she hadn't used in a year. "You found her," she said, her voice sounding like crushed glass. "I want eyes on her 24/7. If she buys milk, I want to know the brand. If she coughs, I want to know who heard it." "And the target?" The voice on the other end asked. "Do we remove her?" "Not yet," Yura whispered, her eyes drifting to the engagement ring on her finger, a ring that suddenly felt too loose. "Fear is a better deterrent than violence. Make her remember why she ran. Send the package." Across the river, the air in Naomi's small apartment felt heavy, though she told herself it was just the humidity. She double-checked the deadbolt, a habit she couldn't break since the twins were born. Leo and Micah were finally asleep, their soft, rhythmic breathing the only sound in the sudden silence of the night. Naomi turned off the hallway light, but a flash of white against the dark floorboards caught her eye. An envelope. Thick, cream-colored, expensive. It had been slid under her door without a sound. No knock. No footsteps. Just the silent arrival of a ghost. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she picked it up. It felt heavy in her hand. She tore the seal, her fingers trembling despite her resolve. Inside was a single photograph. It was high resolution, cruel in its clarity. It captured the exact moment her life had ended 20 months ago. Naomi, sprawled on the cold marble floor of the gala, mascara streaked down her face, her hand reaching out toward a man whose back was turned. It was a portrait of absolute humiliation. She flipped the photo over. There was no return address, just jagged handwriting in red ink. Some trash should stay buried. Remember your place. Naomi sank onto the floor, the photo crinkling in her grip. The threat was designed to break her, to send her running back into the shadows. But as she looked toward the bedroom where her son slept, the trembling in her hands stopped. She wasn't the girl on the floor anymore. And this time, she wouldn't be the one who broke. The bell above the door of the bistro didn't just chime. It tolled. When Seo Jin-hoon stepped inside, the lunchtime chatter died instantly. His presence sucked the oxygen out of the room, a dark gravity that pulled every eye toward him. Two of his guards stayed by the entrance, silently turning the sign to closed, while Jin-hoon walked straight toward the counter. Naomi was there, her back turned, loading a tray with water glasses. She wore a simple black uniform, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that highlighted the line of her neck, the same neck he had once adorned with diamonds, now bare. "Naomi." His voice was low, a rumble that usually made business partners sweat and rivals tremble. He expected her shoulders to tense. He expected the tray to rattle in her hands. She didn't flinch. She didn't even turn around. She calmly placed the last glass on the tray, checked the order ticket, and walked past him as if he were nothing more than a ghost haunting the wrong building. Jin-hoon felt a shock of disbelief hotter than rage. He followed her to a corner table, watching as she set the drinks down for a terrified couple who looked ready to bolt through the window. "I said, look at me," Jin-hoon snapped, stepping into her path as she turned back toward the kitchen. Naomi finally stopped. She looked up, her expression unreadable. There was no fear in her dark eyes, no tears, no pleading. Just a flat, devastating calm. It was a look that stripped him of his title, his money, and his reputation, leaving just a man standing in the way of her job. "You're disrupting the customers," she said softly. Her voice wasn't shaking. "I don't care about the customers," he hissed, leaning in, his expensive Italian suit brushing against her cheap apron. "I care about the timeline. 11 months, Naomi. The twins are 11 months old." He waited for the panic. He waited for her to beg him not to take them, or to deny it, or to crumble under the weight of his realization. Instead, she pulled a rag from her apron pocket and wiped a spot on the counter next to his hand. "If you're not ordering, you need to leave." "Do not play games with me," he growled, his control fraying at the edges. "Were you pregnant? That night? Did I throw my own children out into the street?" Naomi paused. The air between them crackled, thick with the ghost of the gala and the humiliation he had served her on a silver platter. She held his gaze for a long, suffocating second. "You made it very clear that night that I was nothing to you. A liar. A traitor. Trash." She stepped closer, invading his personal space with a quiet intensity that forced him to take a subconscious half-step back. "Trash doesn't answer questions, Mr. CO. And it certainly doesn't owe you the truth." She sidestepped him smoothly, her movement fluid and dismissive. "Table 4 needs water. Move." Jin-hoon stood rooted to the spot, his hands clenched in useless fists. He had come here to demand answers, to corner her, to assert the dominance that was his birthright. But as he watched her walk away, straight-backed and completely unbothered by the monster in her restaurant, he realized with a sinking horror that in this room, he was the one who had no power at all. The private clinic smelled of antiseptic and silence, a place where the wealthy paid to have their secrets dissected under a microscope. CO Jin-hoon stood by the window, staring out at the gray Seoul skyline, but seeing nothing. His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, hollowed out, stripped of the arrogance that usually armored him. "Mr. CO, the doctor said, his voice hesitant. He placed a sealed envelope on the steel table. "We ran the samples 3 times as you requested. There is no margin for error." Jin-hoon turned slowly. The envelope sat there like a loaded gun. He had spent a fortune and called in a dozen favors to obtain the samples from the hospital waste after the twins' last checkup, bypassing every legal protocol. He needed to know, but a part of him, the cowardly part he didn't know existed, prayed for a negative result. If they weren't his, he was just a cruel ex-fiancé. If they were his, he was a monster. He picked up the envelope. His hands, which had signed death warrants without shaking, trembled. He tore the seal. The document was dense with medical jargon, but his eyes hunted for the only line that mattered. Probability of paternity, 99.9998%. The air left his lungs in a sharp, agonizing rush. He gripped the edge of the table, the paper crumping under his fingers. Mine. They were his. The little boy with the serious brow, the other one with the dimpled chin. They were his flesh, his blood, his legacy. And he had thrown them away. A wave of nausea rolled over him, violent and suffocating. He remembered the night of the gala, the way he had sneered at Naomi, calling her a whore, accusing her of carrying another man's bastard. He remembered the way she had cradled her stomach, protecting them from his rage. He had tried to destroy his own children before they had even taken their first breath. But the horror didn't stop there. It deepened, twisting into a sick realization. He had cast them out into the cold, leaving them vulnerable and fatherless, while he went back to a penthouse shared with CO Yura. Yura, the woman who had brought him the proof. The woman who had whispered in his ear that Naomi was unfaithful. The woman who was currently wearing his ring, sleeping in his bed, and spending his money. He had abandoned his own innocent blood to embrace the snake that had bitten them. Jin-hoon looked at the number again, 99.9%. It wasn't just a statistic, it was a condemnation. He sank into the leather chair, burying his face in his hands. He was the king of Seoul, the man everyone feared, but in that sterile white room, CO Jin-hoon realized he was nothing but a fool who had burned down his own kingdom. CO Yura paced the length of the penthouse living room, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the marble. Jin-hoon hadn't come home last night. He hadn't answered her calls. His assistant, Min, had blocked her access to the office. The silence from the man who was supposed to be her puppet was deafening. She knew what it meant. He was looking. And if he looked long enough, he would find the twins. She stopped at the window, staring down at the ants crawling through the streets of Seoul. She couldn't let it happen. She had worked too hard, lied too well, and sacrificed too much dignity to lose her crown to a waitress. If Jin-hoon found out, she wouldn't just lose the marriage, she would lose her life. She lifted her phone to her ear. "Do it," she said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the adrenaline of a gambler pushing all her chips into the center. "Today. Make it look like a tragic accident, a distracted driver, a brake failure. I don't care." "And the children?" the voice asked. Yura closed her eyes. Collateral damage. An hour later, the afternoon sun was blindingly bright as Naomi pushed the double stroller toward the crosswalk. The city hummed with life, a stark contrast to the dread that had been sitting in her stomach since the photo slid under her door. She needed diapers and formula. She couldn't hide in the apartment forever. The pedestrian light turned green. The little white walking man flickered on. Naomi stepped off the curb, checking left, then right. Traffic was stopped. It was safe. She was halfway across the intersection when she heard it. Not the idle hum of traffic, but the sharp, aggressive rev of an engine. She turned her head. A black sedan, 3 lanes away, had pulled out of the line of stopped cars. It wasn't turning. It was accelerating. Straight at her. Time warped. She saw the sun glinting off the windshield, obscuring the driver. She saw the grille of the car expanding rapidly, looking like the mouth of a metal beast. She realized with a jolt of primal terror that the car wasn't swerving to avoid her. It was correcting its angle to ensure it hit the stroller. No! Naomi screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. Instinct took over where thought failed. She didn't try to run. There was no time. Instead, she threw her entire body weight against the stroller, shoving it violently toward the sidewalk, and dove in the opposite direction. The sedan screamed past, the side mirror clipping Naomi's shoulder with a sickening thud. The wind of its passing whipped her hair across her face, hot and smelling of burnt rubber. She hit the asphalt hard, her knees scraping raw against the grit. The car didn't stop. It didn't brake. It squealed around the corner and vanished into the city. Silence followed, heavy and terrible, broken a second later by the terrified wails of the twins. Naomi scrambled up, ignoring the blood dripping from her arm, and ran to the stroller. It had tipped onto 2 wheels but stayed upright, jammed against the curb. Leo and Micah were screaming, red-faced and startled, but alive. Naomi collapsed beside them, her hands shaking so hard she could barely touch their faces to check for injuries. People were running over now, shouting, asking if she was okay, calling for police. Naomi didn't hear them. She stared at the empty street where the black car had disappeared. The warning photo had been a threat. This was a promise. The war had shifted from whispers and shadows to blood and asphalt, and Naomi realized with chilling clarity that they weren't just trying to scare her anymore. They were trying to erase her. Naomi was wiping dried blood from her elbow when the hallway exploded. It wasn't a bomb, but the sound of bodies colliding against drywall, violent and abrupt, followed by the wet thud of something heavy hitting the floor. She froze, the washcloth hovering over her skin. The twins were in their cribs, finally asleep after the trauma of the afternoon. She grabbed the longest kitchen knife she owned and backed toward the bedroom, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The lock on her front door didn't just click, it shattered. The door swung open, revealing a silhouette framed by the hallway light. Naomi raised the knife, her hands shaking. Stay back. Seo Jin-hoon stepped into the light. He wasn't wearing his usual pristine suit. He was in a dark shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. Behind him, she saw 2 of his guards dragging a limp figure toward the stairwell. Put the knife down, Naomi, he said, his voice tight with controlled panic. You did this, she spat, backing up until she hit the nursery door. You and your psycho fiancé tried to kill us today. I know, he said, and the raw admission in his voice stopped her cold. And she sent a second team tonight. My men just stopped them at the elevator. But a third team is 5 minutes away. He crossed the room in 2 long strides. Naomi slashed the knife through the air, but he caught her wrist mid-swing. He didn't hurt her. He just immobilized her, his grip firm but careful. He looked at the bandage on her arm from the earlier accident, and a muscle in his jaw jumped violently. I am not asking you to trust me, he said, his dark eyes burning into hers. I am telling you that if you stay here, you and those boys will be dead by sunrise. I'm not going with you, she whispered, though the fight was draining out of her legs. You are. He released her wrist and moved past her into the bedroom. Don't touch them, she screamed, chasing him. But he was already there. He didn't wake them. With surprising gentleness, he lifted Micah from the crib, tucking the sleeping infant against his chest as if he were made of glass. He signaled to his head of security, who scooped up Leo. "Min, get the bags," Jin-hoon ordered. He turned to Naomi. "Walk, or I carry you." "I can walk," she hissed, limping after him, fueled by pure maternal rage. They moved down the back stairs, surrounded by a phalanx of Jin-hoon's guards. The alleyway was blocked by a massive, matte black armored SUV. The door slid open, and Jin-hoon placed Micah into a pre-installed car seat. He had prepared. Naomi hesitated at the door, looking at the metal beast that belonged to a world she despised. "Naomi," Jin-hoon said, extending a hand to help her in. She ignored it, climbing in painfully on her own. He slid in beside her, the heavy door sealing them in with a pressurized hiss. The silence was absolute. As the car sped away, weaving through the shadows of Seoul, Jin-hoon didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead, his hand resting on the door handle, his body a rigid line of defense between the world and the family he had almost destroyed. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The fortress," he replied, watching the twins sleep soundly in the safety of his car. "The only place she can't reach you." The fortress was a tomb of silence, broken only by the hum of servers in the secure wing. In the living quarters, Jin-hoon placed a tablet on the coffee table in front of Naomi. His hand lingered on the device, a reluctance to relive the deception visible in the tension of his knuckles. "Read it," he said, his voice stripped of command, leaving only exhaustion. Naomi picked it up. It was a forensic digital report. Timestamps, IP addresses, recovered chat logs. She saw her own name, followed by messages she had never sent, photos that had been digitally altered, and a transfer of funds to a witness she had never met. It was a masterpiece of destruction, orchestrated by a ghost. "It was Yura," Jin-hoon said, watching her face. "Every text, every photo that I used to condemn you, she forged them. She hired a team to plant the evidence on your phone while you slept." Naomi lowered the tablet. The vindication didn't taste sweet. It tasted like ash. "And you believed it. You didn't ask me. You didn't fight for me. You just looked at a screen and threw me away." "I was a fool," Jin-hoon admitted, the words heavy and final. "And I am about to correct it." An hour later, Jin-hoon stood at the head of a massive obsidian table in the syndicate's boardroom. 12 of the most powerful men in the organization sat in silence. They expected a briefing on the attempted hit. They got an execution. The attack on the safe house was not a rival clan, Jin-hoon announced, his voice cold enough to freeze the air in the room. He pressed a button on the console. The screen behind him lit up. It wasn't a spreadsheet. It was a recording of a voice call, unmistakable in its shrill desperation. "I don't care if the mother survives, but the twins must be removed. They are a threat to the merger. Burn the apartment if you have to." The board members shifted, murmuring. To attack the boss was treason. To order a hit on his bloodline was a death sentence. "Seo Yura attempted to murder my heirs," Jin-hoon stated, looking at the empty chair at his right hand, the seat Yura had fought so hard to occupy. "She is no longer protected." Across the city, at the private terminal of Incheon Airport, Seo Yura was shaking. Her passport was in her hand, her knuckles white. She handed it to the attendant, forcing a smile that felt like it was cracking her face. "One way to Zurich. Now." The attendant typed, frowned, and typed again. "I'm sorry, Miss Seo. There is a flag on your travel status." "That's impossible," Yura hissed, reaching for the documents. "Do you know who I am?" "We do," a deep voice said behind her. Yura spun around. It wasn't Jin-hoon. It was the police, flanked by 2 of Jin-hoon's personal attorneys. "Seo Yura," the officer said, stepping forward as the terminal fell silent. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and digital espionage." As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Yura looked past the officers to the glass doors. She expected to see Jin-hoon watching, gloating. But the driveway was empty. He hadn't come to watch her fall. She realized then, with a final, crushing despair that to him, she was no longer an enemy worth facing. She was already a memory. The silence in the safe house was different now. It wasn't heavy with the threat of death. It was heavy with the weight of things that still needed to be said. Seo Jin-hoon stood by the window, watching the sun rise over a city that felt slightly cleaner than it had the day before. On the coffee table lay a thick leather portfolio. "It's done," he said, turning to face Naomi. She was feeding Leo a bottle, her movements rhythmic and soothing. "Yura is in custody. The lawyers ensure she will never see daylight again." Naomi didn't look up. "Good." "The portfolio," Jin-hoon continued, gesturing to the table. "It contains the deed to a villa in Hanamdong under your name. Full security detail, paid for life. A trust fund for the boys that rivals the GDP of a small country. And a black card with no limit." He took a step closer, his voice softening. "I want to give you the world, Naomi. I want to give you the life I stole from you." Naomi finally looked up. She capped the bottle, burped Leo gently, and placed him in the bassinet. Then she stood and walked to the table. She looked at the portfolio, the keys to a kingdom, and then she looked at Jin-hoon. "No," she said. Jin-hoon blinked.
No?
"Naomi, this isn't charity. This is restitution. It's safety." "It's a cage," she corrected, her voice steady. "A golden one, but still a cage. I don't want your money, Jin-hoon. I don't want your guards watching me sleep, and I definitely don't want a life built on the proceeds of the violence that almost killed my sons." "Then what do you want?" he asked, a desperate edge creeping into his tone. "I am the father of those children. I have a right." "You have biology," she cut him off, stepping into his space. "You don't have rights. Not yet." She took a breath, her gaze searching his face, looking for the man she had loved beneath the armor of the boss. "You can see them," she said softly. Jin-hoon's chest heaved with a sudden, sharp intake of air. "I can. You can visit. You can learn their names. You can learn that Micah hates peas and Leo cries when it rains. But you do not sleep in my house. You do not buy my affection. And you do not make decisions for me." She reached out, her finger hovering over his chest, right over his heart. "You stand there," she whispered, pointing to the space between them. "You stay a little farther away. Because the man standing in front of me knows how to break things. He knows how to destroy. I need a father who knows how to build." Jin-hoon looked at the distance between them. Only a few feet, but it felt like an ocean he had to swim across. He understood then that she wasn't punishing him. She was teaching him. "I will wait," he vowed, his voice thick with emotion. "However long it takes." "Good," Naomi said, picking up the portfolio and handing it back to him. "Then start by taking this with you when you leave." The rain lashed against the windows of the Hanamdong villa, echoing the night, 20 months ago, when he had thrown her out. Seo Jin-hoon stood by the door, his coat in hand. It had been a year of dinners, of playdates, of tentative touches, but he still slept in his own apartment across the city. He turned, his hand tightening on the doorknob until his knuckles turned white. "Let me stay," he said. The vulnerability in his voice was raw, terrifyingly open. "The boys are asleep. I don't want to leave you alone in the storm." Naomi stood at the kitchen island, her spine stiffening. The domestic warmth evaporated instantly. "Go home, Jin-hoon." "Why?" He stepped closer, the frustration of a penitent man finally bleeding through the cracks of his patience. "I have done everything. I dismantled the syndicate. I sold the casinos. I am not the boss anymore. I am just a man standing in your kitchen. When will it be enough?" "When I say it is," Naomi snapped, the sharp edge of her trauma cutting through the peace they had painstakingly built. She walked up to him, her eyes blazing with a sudden, renewed fire. "You think 12 months of being a good father erases the night you called me a whore in front of all of Seoul? You think buying a security firm wipes out the memory of me begging you to listen while you looked at me with disgust?" She shoved his chest, a physical rejection of his plea. "You broke me, Jin-hoon. You don't get to decide when I'm fixed. If you can't handle the distance, then leave for good." The air in the hallway screamed with tension. The audience of invisible ghosts watched, waiting for the alpha to snap, for the old Jin-hoon to demand his rights. But the man standing before her didn't shout. He didn't grab her wrists. He looked at her with a devastating, quiet sorrow, and then he bowed his head. "You're right," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I have no right to ask for time. I only have the right to wait." He opened the door, the cold wind rushing in and soaking his shirt. "I'm sorry, Naomi. I'll be here tomorrow. And the day after that." He stepped out into the rain, willing to endure the cold so she didn't have to feel pressured. "Wait." The word was soft, barely audible over the thunder, but it stopped him dead. Naomi was watching him, her chest heaving. She saw the man who had walked away from absolute power and now was walking away from the woman he loved simply because she asked him to. He had passed the final test. He wasn't trying to own her. He was serving her. "Close the door," she said, her voice trembling. "You're letting the heat out." Jin-hoon closed it, the click of the latch sounding like a promise kept. An hour later, the storm outside was forgotten. Jin-hoon sat on the living room rug, his expensive shirt wrinkled, reading a storybook to the twins who had woken up from the thunder. "And the wolf," Jin-hoon read, his voice rumbling softly, "promised to guard the house forever, not as a king, but as a father." Leo rested his head on Jin-hoon's knee. Micah was already asleep in his arms. Naomi watched from the doorway, her heart finally unclenching. The fear was gone, replaced by a fragile, beautiful certainty. They hadn't just fixed the past, they had buried it, building a wiser, stronger love on the ashes. "The end," Jin-hoon whispered. "No," Naomi said, walking over and sitting beside him, resting her head on his shoulder for the first time in 2 years. "It's just the beginning."